Alright, so this is my premiere YouTube video. I've been making videos quite a while on Facebook, but I want to expand over to this country, so that's what I'm gonna do. My name is Zebra, and I'm particularly interested in the psychological and physiological transformation of the human being, which in the past has been called mysticism. I consider mysticism an internal science. It's a way of investigating through direct experience rather than through any particular instrument. And I'm sure there's going to be folks crossing over to this channel from my Facebook, so apologies if anything's redundant. I just want to sort of introduce anybody new who might be watching to a little bit of my style or feeling, you could say, if I have just one. So, one of the basic focuses of the sort of mystical and psychological framework of the human being and human experience that I try to present, and I try to present mostly without any firm models for a specific reason, is that actually most real spiritual transformation is physical. What I mean by that is that the role of the human body, human organism, in the creation of cosmologies and the reasons that cosmologies are resonant with us, and also in the creation of descriptions of experience, as well as having a central role in spiritual and mystical experience, has been inestimably downplayed or talked around. And part of the reason for this is, from what I understand anyways, the human body is still coming to an awareness of itself. So, you could compare the human body to an astronaut in a sci-fi movie who's put into a cryogenic freeze tank and put into an automated slumber until they reach a certain destination or a certain proximity of their destination. And when the ship gets within a certain distance of that destination, the astronaut from this hypothetical sci-fi movie is going to have some mechanism be triggered in the tank which awakens them, and possibly also some little video installed into the tank which gives them all the instructions they need to remember what they were there to do. I think this is a really profound image for the human body, or the human organism, in terms of evolutionary intelligence, the evolution of self-awareness, and the overall goal, or the overall teleology, the overall arc of human evolution. The only difference is that the human body was not sent from somewhere exactly. It started off in the cryogenic tank. It started off asleep as a sort of new organizational pattern of organic matter, if you want to call it that. There was only so much that the human body could do to become aware of itself. It couldn't just start aware of itself from the get-go. There had to be a historical process, and that historical process is akin to the voyage of the sleeping astronaut. It's identical to what we call history. What if history is actually a sort of programmed, automatic voyage that the sleeping human body is having to take until the right point of proximity to its goal, which is self-awareness. And at that point, it will suddenly start to come out of its hypnosis. And perhaps there will be a little instructional tape built inside of it for just the right time that will remind it what its mission was. So just as I'm using a media image, you could say, or an artistic image to depict the propulsion and overall plot of the human body's awakening to itself, the human organism coming to self-cognizance, coming to self-awareness. In the same way, I feel that most images like that, most artistic or mythological images, have been spontaneously generated in order to mirror certain functionings and certain sort of invisible processes happening in the human organism. For instance, the example I gave of this on my Facebook page, which is an easy example, so I'll give it again, is that of Satan. Satan, and I'm going to use the example of the book of Job in the Bible. Satan is paid, basically. He's given permission by God, by Yahweh, which isn't exactly, that's getting into a whole theological discussion, but he's given permission by God to torture Job, who is one of God's most pious followers, one of God's most pious servants. And it's only through the ceaseless tortures that come from Satan that Job gradually acquires an understanding of God, which surpasses perhaps even the understanding God has of itself at that point. So I want to take this mythological image and say, well, how would this sort of divine cosmic imagery translate into intrinsic, innate, structural things happening in the human body? And to begin, we can start by saying that what we call mind, by which I mean thought, conscious thought, quote unquote, could be equated with Satan. And God in the story could be equated with the unconscious, that is, unactualized, unaware of itself blind, in a way, human body. And so we have Satan, the intellect, the mind, which is created by the human body, where we can say given permission by the human body to torture Job. And what would Job be in this case? Job might be a different layer of the personality which is involved in trying to come to a consciousness of the human body. So I want to make something clear, which is that the mind itself, the personality, is not unitary, it's multiplicitous. It's plural. And this is a major disaster in psychiatry and psychology, because there's some idea that it's pathological to have multiple personalities. But the fact of the matter is that if you are honest with yourself about your behavior, you'll very quickly come to see or begin to see that you have multiple personalities, whether you have fucking bipolar or schizoaffective or whatever they want to put a name on it. For instance, do you act the same way around your mother as you do around a girl you've just started hooking up with? And when we say, okay, but that's just the way we're acting. But that's what the personality is. It's a form of acting. So because we have different modes of acting, we must have multiple personalities. And so we can view Satan in this metaphor as the testing and doubting inner voice of the intellect. And we can view Job, in this case, as the tested, the one who's given trials, the one who undertakes the journey, the one who tries to understand, as a sort of alternate ego. So we have the intellect, which is serving as a primary ego, and you could call it the seeker, or the servant, or the substitute self, which is aiming to reconcile these experiences that it's having with Satan with its own understanding of God. Now, this is all starting to get complicated, but it goes to show that if you take this approach, there's a very nuanced language that appears in the mythological imagery that can actually be taken to speak of the human body on autopilot coming to gradually understand what it is. So, because in the tale, and I'm going to drop this metaphor in a moment and move on, but because in the tale that it's through the plagues that are put on his household, the murder of his daughters, the diseases he faces, because it's through these forms of suffering, and in a sense torture, that Job is able to comprehend the vastness of what God is. We can also say that it's through the suffering that our thinking mind causes us, that the thinking intellect causes us, that gradually the substitute self in us is able to re-merge and also become conscious of the entire organism, which would be God, coming to awareness of itself. And this is drawing slightly from Carl Jung's essay on the Job book, which is called Answer to Job, and it's one of my favorite things Jung ever did, which is saying a lot. Jung had a very profound impact on me for a certain period of time. And I'm sure he still does, but I've sort of moved on into my own thing. And so I threw out a term back there called substitute self. This is a term I've made. And it's a rather difficult idea to frame, but what it means is that taking this base narrative that I started this video with of the astronaut who's sleeping until the right time where he's activated, you could consider who that astronaut has to be until he's activated as the substitute self. So let's apply this to the human organism. Who the human organism has to pretend to be until it comes to a full awareness of itself is what I mean by substitute self. And to try and make that even clearer, understanding that we're not fully conscious of ourselves or what we are, that the human body is still evolving towards that awareness, towards its own self-comprehension and maybe its own eventual meta-programming of itself, its own grasping of its own evolutionary trajectory. Because it's not aware of itself, there needs to be a sort of quasi-awareness, which is put in place until that awareness is able to become manifest. And this quasi-awareness is what throughout the history of mankind we've called quote-unquote consciousness. What we call consciousness is an awareness of some mental phenomena usually. So we have a thought, right? And a thought can be considered a physically generated or at least mediated sensation. Really, that's all it is on the level of human experience in the physical body. But when you're aware of that thought, we call that consciousness. But is this actually consciousness? Is it actually awareness? Or is it an automatic mechanical process? My argument, and it may sound strange, but my argument is that what we call consciousness is an automatic mechanical process which functions as a substitute self until the correct point when the organism as a whole can reorganize itself and become cognizant of itself in an entirely novel and unprecedented way. And that's why we have, by the way, I'm trying not to name drop too much random imagery that can be correlated to all this, because I'm sure I'll have plenty of videos to elaborate. But that's why we have all these fanatical ideas going around about the singularity, about technology becoming aware of itself. It's actually a projection of the internal hardware of the human body gradually becoming aware of itself. And that's another example of how images are spontaneously produced to reflect invisible evolutionary processes that are happening in the human body. So the substitute self, the thinking self, the quasi-awareness, has really inhabited the human body for most of history, because we've been in that long voyage to our destination. And we've mistaken it for the actual us. What that means is we've mistaken our consciousness, our awareness of our mental processes, as what we fundamentally are, or who we truly are. And as opposed to a lot of non-dualistic Neo-Advaita or Eastern-based, what I essentially see as mythologies, which just say that what we are is either one, God, two, the one, three, the source, which these are all, again, descriptive words that don't really mean what they're trying to say and don't mean what they're presented as meaning. Instead of that explanation, when I say what we fundamentally are, I mean that we fundamentally are this human animal. The human animal that's watching, we are these human organisms. But because we've been in a sort of intermediary phase where we've created this substitute self to stand in for the authentic human being, to carry out a certain process that will bring about self-awareness, we've come to all sorts of minimizations and maximizations of who we are based on that one little fact of consciousness. What I mean is, because we have the sense, because consciousness in a sense is a sense of separation from the human body, because you can only be aware of your mental processes if, as I've said many, many times before, if your organism has been split into an observer and an observed. So the only possibility of what we call consciousness can only be made feasible when there is a certain degree of separation within the organism from itself. And so this sense of having a separate identity, a thinker, a soul, whatever, is extrapolated and stretched out into huge ideas such as we're just consciousness. We're just consciousness. And this creates some sort of other consciousness which is elsewhere. Or we're just spirit. Or that we are simply the universe experiencing itself. Even this, sorry Alan Watts, but even this is a myth. It's an extrapolation of the sense of separation from the facts of our biology, the facts of what's in front of us all the time. If you have the experience, which I assure you is possible, of this consciousness disappearing and shutting down, call it ego death, call it death and rebirth, call it a system reboot. I might call it something like that, more likely. If you have that experience, all that's left in the absence of that consciousness is the human body functioning completely autonomously. What that means is that there's no longer a sense that the human body is controlling itself or directing itself. It's functioning completely on its own. And this is a very strange sensation for people to experience when they've been so attached to the substitute self for so long. Because the substitute self is predicated on the experience of the sense of the body controlling itself and regulating itself, or the brain controlling the body might be one way of putting it. And the reason that this phenomenon has come into existence, come into our experience, from what I understand, just based on my own experience, which is all I have, is so that a certain mirroring process can occur. And maybe I'll pause for a second to consider how to put this, because there's a lot of complexity at what I'm getting at in this overall video, but this in itself is pretty webbed. The reason the substitute self has come into being is so that all the things in history, and this is a bit of a wilder interpretation, but I'm just going to put it out there, all the things in history that required us to, in some sense, separate from nature would be possible. And what I mean is doing things such as building an industrial civilization, which obviously negatively influences many of our neighboring species on this planet. But there may be some higher purpose, you could say, to all the destruction. Just like there's a higher purpose to Job being tortured by Satan. Because it wouldn't be possible, I should say, for us to behave in such a way if we hadn't separated from nature. And what I mean by that is also separated from our own organic chemistry. If you have the experience of just living fully as this organism, there's no possibility of being able to be destructive towards your fellow living beings in such a way that disregards your responsibility in doing so. The only possibility of doing this comes into being when when there has been formed a substitute self in the organism. And it's basically like dirty work, The dirty work has to be done to set the stage for the later stage where it's justified. Whether that happens remains to be seen, but I have faith that it will. Because we are not actually in control, what we think is in control is the substitute neural program self. We think that the astronaut that's on the voyage is the one determining its destination. In fact, the astronaut on the voyage is inside of a vehicle which is programmed from the beginning to get to a certain place. The astronaut doesn't have to do anything. The astronaut is awoken automatically, given directions automatically, and then spends the rest of the trip cooperating automatically with the ship to get to the destination. There's no choice. In the same way, I want to open the possibility that most of history has been an automatic mechanical process. I know these are pretty bold claims, but I'm a bold individual. So consider possibly that instead of history being anything that was directed by the human mind, that instead the human mind, the substitute self, has all this time been directed by an internal programming language, a natural intelligence, which is always coordinated, is always set on the coordinates of self-awareness. But because the human organism, like Yahweh, is blind to itself and doesn't fully understand itself, the implementation of all these destructive habits forces a further degree of self-reflection to come into being. Just like Job is forced to reflect from the trials he undergoes. So because it's almost like everything we've done in history is like a Rorschach blot, an ink blot that they give in psychological tests, or Play-Doh. Because we're all human organisms that are not fully online, when we look out at the deeds of history, the quote-unquote atrocities and the quote-unquote miracles and accomplishments, the progress, whether you want to call it progress, the advancement in all the technological means and the means of expression, everything. You can't deny that there's an advancement there. To deny that is just bitterness, That all these are in some way mirrors. So the substitute self also functions as a mirror self, or mirror selves, you could say. What that means is that our mind, which is what I'm basically I'm equating the human mind with what I'm calling the substitute self. The human mind can only perceive reflections of itself. Reflections of the unmitigated, unprocessed, undiscovered data inside of the human organism, embedded inside of it. This embedded data in the human organism that tells us who we are is projected outward. Because we don't have the capacity, we're coming to it, but we haven't had the capacity to be fully aware of who we are as an individual organism. And so instead of that processing power, which we have insufficient funds to get right now, the energy goes into producing a sort of play. And this is what's meant in the Hindu mythology by Leela, by the play. It's actually not how someone like Alan Watts describes it, which is that, or if you look at Alan Watts's description also as a metaphor, then it could be. But Alan Watts describes this play that's going on as God taking on all the roles. But if we equate God, like I have already, with the human body coming to consciousness of itself, then it's actually the human body that's taking on all the roles. And by taking on these roles, it creates a vast network of mirrors where each human body perceives its own embedded unconscious information in the other human bodies. And if this weren't an automated process, it'd be a very dangerous thing because we're all in a hall of mirrors. But because it is an automated process and it's actually the unconscious, unaware intelligence which directs the ship. It's the hardware in the walls of the ship that directs the ship. It's not the electric signals that come up on its dashboard. So in the same way, it's actually the unconscious cellular intelligence of the human body that directs evolution, not the little lights that come up in our head. So this mirroring process, the little lights that come up, is also automatic. It's also automated. It just happens. Because the intelligence of evolution can't direct itself in the way that the conscious thinking mind thinks it can direct things. It can only naturally, spontaneously grow towards its blueprint, towards the fulfillment of the blueprint. And when it grows to a certain point where it's seen enough of its own roles and the roles of others to comprehend that it's the one, that the organism itself is the one playing all these roles, only then will the circuitry go off and the astronaut be awakened. When that point has been reached, it's because we're within proximity of Jupiter. We're within proximity of the planet that we've been sent to go to. And I don't mean Jupiter literally. I'm referencing 2001: A Space Odyssey, which is partially what I'm basing this imagery on. When that point's been reached, the natural process of history has reached such a point in the mirroring process of these mirror selves, the substitute selves, that this program can now shut down and the human organism itself starts to wake up, starts to go, shit, I'm alive, shit, I'm here, shit, I'm real. It's like stepping out of a dream, like they often describe awakening. The dream, though, is not that the universe is a dream or that life is a dream. The dream is the dream caused by an incomplete perception of ourselves that's created in our heads. It's caused by a still actualizing evolutionary process. The dream is the insufficient means we have to understand ourselves so far. So we live in a dream of substitutions for that knowledge. But when we've gotten to a certain point, when we've cooperated with the innate code inside of ourselves, not that we ultimately have a choice, to the point where we've reached the proximity zone and the astronaut's awakened, then the hardware of the human mind, or the ego system, or the substitute self, or the mirror selves, any word you would like to use. I like to use my own words because that way I contribute something new to, the discourse, to the information highway. That mechanism at that point becomes unnecessary. And a lot of people panic when this starts happening because that thing that you've been identified with this whole time, the substitute program, starts to shut down. This is an automatic biological process. It's destined or preordained, you could say, that what we call the human personality will eventually be re-subsumed and made subservient to the human organism itself. And there's no reason to panic, even though, of course, we will, because we don't know what it will be like to be aware of ourselves, because it's literally historically unprecedented. Except in a few rare cases, and we call those people liberated beings or enlightened beings. Or geniuses. So, we have no way of knowing what our awareness of ourselves will feel like. None at all, because like I said, it's a evolutionarily unprecedented change. So when the mind starts shutting down, we come up with all sorts of narratives, like I said, substitutions for real knowledge of ourselves, that we're going crazy, that we're gonna die, that, what are some others I've seen or experienced, that we're losing control. We never had it, so it's not a matter of loss of control. Or that just basically somehow in some way we're moving in the direction of impendent doom. That's what the feeling is, because I've gone through this process. But this is only also a mirror, because it's not the organism itself, the authentic self, which perishes. It's not the authentic self which doesn't make it to the destination. It's the sleeping astronaut in the cryogenic chamber which doesn't make it, which means that the neurological program that we call quote-unquote consciousness, quote-unquote sense of self, quote-unquote personality, is not going to be the one that makes it to the end of the voyage it took. It gets there and it burns up, and what's left is the naked human organism itself for the first time coming into life. And that's why the awakening experience, what I mean by awakening, is, like I said, oh shit, I'm alive. Oh shit, I'm real. Oh shit, this is here. This is a completely explosive acknowledgement of the human biology of its existence. It's not fully aware that it's alive. It's not fully aware of its existence, because it's still running through this mechanized, automated substitution mirroring process. So the awakening is when it finally becomes cognizant of the fact that it is in fact real, that the human body is in fact alive. And that joy that's felt, the relief that's felt when this happens, is not just your relief or my relief, it's the relief of the entire species at having made it to the destination, to where it was programmed to arrive eventually. It's the joy of God finally grasping itself. And understand, I'm using God entirely metaphorically for nothing other than the complex, hyper-intelligent human body itself. So, YouTube, nice to meet you. Thank you for staring at my grease-ridden hippie hair for 40 minutes. And I will have more to you soon.